All right. So like I said, I wanted to do some demonstrations today just to introduce everybody to working with this clay. So, Sam, did you have one of the blocks of clay there? I've already got them, but just one. I just forgot to actually have the thing on hand. So obviously, you've all already gotten this clay. If you didn't already, we're using 2 bricks of this Chavant clay. This is just one of the brands of clay. Doesn't really matter. We're using the standard, it's high melt, which means it can take heat. So it is intended to actually be more heat resistant. It's a bit more rigid. Some of you have already started to play with it. It is pretty stiff. So one of the things about, I realize I forget about the camera. One of the things about this clay is it is very stiff. So first and foremost, take breaks. It's gonna stress your hands out. If you're not used to working with clay like this, it is definitely going to stress your hands out. So just take breaks, stand up, shake them out, that sort of fun. Anyway, so how this works, this is oil-based clay, so it will not dry out. But that also comes with different properties in that, like water, your standard water-based clay, you do let it dry out and it starts to harden. You can work the surface differently, that sort of thing. You can reconstitute it, get it wet again, and it will get softer. This doesn't work quite the same way. It will not dry out. However, what that means is it normally will not change properties. It's going to stay as firm as it is, except for with heat. Now, that's not necessarily in relation to the high melt thing. That's in relation to, you can actually, I have to do this myself, but you can actually heat this up to a liquid. For the love of God, do not touch that, because that would be sticking your hand into napalm. It takes a good amount of heat, and then it's like extra sticky gooey and definitely at serious injury temperatures. So don't do that. But the idea is this actually can be poured into molds. So I understand. We're not doing that. But what we are going to be doing is finding ways to warm this up so it's a bit more pliable to work with. So I did a short video as well. If you don't already have like some kind of a wire tool for like just clay working, I made this little video. I made a video on just making a wire tool. I just used an old pencil for handles. Definitely use a pencil or something like that. And don't just make loops, because you'll have to, when you go to try to pull this through the clay, it will definitely cut into your fingers. So use a handle, really simple. If you have, if you're taking ceramics or anything, same tool, that works fine. But this works really well to slice your clay into smaller pieces. Just pull backwards, and this is actually, oops, I forgot to take some of the plastic off. That's right, because I was demonstrating actually cutting right through the plastic wrap. Not ideal, but it works well. Main thing is use something dull. A wire tool, like a butter knife if you need to, something like that. Do not use a sharp blade. It is wholly unnecessary, because a dull blade will cut through just as well. However, the amount of force you have to put through to get through this oil clay, you're very likely to go right through the clay and into the old hand meat. And even more insult to injury than just stitches is something with sticky oil clay that then also has to be cleaned out of a wound. So don't use a sharp knife. Like a butter knife. If you really don't care about a straight edge, you could use that, chop through style. That works. But use something like that. So let me turn down the camera down here so I can show some other stuff here. So work with Chavant clay. Thing is, this works really well by warming it up a little bit. And to do that more easily, cut it up into smaller bricks. Now again, I left some plastic wrap on there. Make sure you get that off of there. Once it's small enough, you can easily tear this stuff. And once you start doing that, you can heat it up just by working it in your hands. If you have like a sunny windowsill, obviously on a sunny day, chop it up into some bricks, stick it out on the windowsill. Just the heat or just the sunlight will help warm it up. You can put this in the microwave. Do not put it in for very long, like 30-second increments at most, because this will very quickly, just like a good old frozen burrito or something, will very quickly go from cold to, oh my God, this is incineratingly scalding. So be cautious with that. If it's too hot, obviously set it aside, let it cool a little bit. Just to make sure to reiterate, do not use metal bowls if you're putting it in the microwave. Again, sometimes we forget that, and we being me. So it won't really also unless you're like really getting this super hot, it's not going to like gross out the microwave or anything like that either. You're just heating it up a little bit. But not a good thing to really test out. But anyway, you're trying to heat this up. One, it will become more pliable when it's warmer. Again, just hand heat works. What it'll also do is bond to itself much more readily. And you want this to bond well, not just by like sticking things together. You want to actually press those on, but then you want to blend pieces together. You want to actually merge the parts. Now, this is going to work well for your project in that it's literally a merging of different bodies. That's kind of part of the idea. But you can always, if you needed like a sharp line between that, you can always take some of your tools. You're going to learn which ones work better, and then just start to work back in and resharpen that line. Some of your best tools, at least for general shaping, is just your hands. Just mushing the stuff together, bending, stretching. It is fairly pliable, but you also see what I mean there is unless it's pretty warm and bonded well, it's going to tear pretty readily. So this stuff is really meant to just be pushed together and then blended by hand, like actually smoothing the clay up and around. But yeah, chop some pieces apart, just have them sitting out at the ready, easily enough done. There you go. Now, I gave everybody 2 bricks of clay. That's quite a lot of this. But the idea for the sculpture is you're wanting to make something that's reasonably sized. Now, that being said, in no way do I recommend, nor should you expect to make this out of a solid brick of clay. This should not be solid. What you want to do is use things for cores. Now, I want to talk about making use of wire for armatures and cores, which means really just something to take up space. Now, I had to excavate some aluminum foil out of another piece that I made, but aluminum foil works really well because you can crush it up to shapes, then you can quickly shape it into a general form. Like if you're making like tentacle or a snake or something like that, sure, great. You can wrap it back around, twist it onto itself. You can attach little pieces to one another.
It's good for texture too.
Exactly, and that's definitely one of the things I'm going to get to. But yeah, thank you. It is also excellent for actually using as a random tool to press into clay and get some really neat textures out of that. So there's a lot of great use for aluminum foil. But one of the things you really want to make use for is taking up space. Mainly because you saw what happened when I just was trying to merge clay together, and if it's too thick, it won't really merge together well at the center. Now, that's going to be a strength issue, especially if you're making something that is larger, or if you're making something that is a bit more free form, that it might be easier for it to like tip over or something like that. Real bad idea with that. So all you do, really just make your shape. Then with your clay, once it's kind of warmed up a little bit, you can either do this piecemeal or just kind of flatten some clay out and then just start to wrap around. Just start to skin the thing with the clay. It works really well just to take up space, and this is still very pliable at that point. It's just that now it won't be quite so dense, and if you need to do like some actual warping or reshaping, it won't be so resistant to doing that. So one of the other things is you can use anything really with this. This is a wad of paper I used. If you're making if you're definitely making something much larger, you don't want to use like a balloon or something. It needs to actually have something physical there. It can't just be like airspace, negative space. But you could use like just wads of paper towels, whatever. If it's somewhat compressible, that's okay, because the clay itself is going to be wrapped around this, and it will compress down, but you can just keep going with that. You can just keep building up on top. And if you realize, you know what, crap, I really wanted this to be a lot larger, you don't have to tear the whole thing apart and add more to the core alone. You could layer on top. I really wanted something like a big knobbly thing right there. That's fine. Then you can start laying on stuff on top. Does this make it a pain to dismantle and reclaim your clay later? Yes, absolutely it does. But these are some of the techniques, and ultimately, if the most you lose out of this clay is a couple little flecks getting stuck in the aluminum, you're pretty well good. So this is very reclaimable clay, meaning as long as you don't drop this and it gets stuck full of hair and dust and crap from the floor and whatnot, then you'll be able to reuse this for years. The The only thing that really damages this clay is exactly that, just collecting too much garbage from, just ambient air, dust, whatever. So that's just the basics on clay work, on cores. But the other option is armatures. Armatures allow you to make much more spindly pieces and actually have them hold shape. The other benefit of that is you can make individual pieces. So this is just a little bit of clay wrapped around a wire, little piece of wire. Blend that as you need, stretch that out as you need. And then you say, you know what? What I really wanted was little antenna on my little rock friend here. The wire also helps you to just stick it down into the piece, and that'll help hold it in place. From there, then you can still actually shape this. Now be careful though, depending on how you cut the wire, you go to bend that thinking it takes a lot more force, and it can, but then you end up with a surprise sharp bit at the end of the clay, or at the end of the wire. So armatures are super useful for whatever you'd like to use. You can make these as intricate or simple as you need. If you need something that's much more like figurative, yeah, go for it. You can make like a stick figure out of this. If you're making something more humanoid, or really any creature like, start with a head. You can easily start to make like, arms and legs. Granted, I'm making something that's more like Slender Man at this point, but whatever. Doesn't have to be super detailed, but ultimately you would have a couple of legs, a head and arm, or head and arms plural, if you want. That's up to you. But the other benefit of something like this is you can then also have like a stray brick of clay or so. All the more reason for having the two bricks. If you needed something that needed like actual structure to stand up. Because if you want this to be freestanding, as if it's intended to be seen as upright, it should be freestanding. Benefit there is you could then stick it down into a brick of clay, and it will stand on its own. Then you could build your clay on top. So don't think that you have to use every bit of clay within the piece itself. You could absolutely keep some back as like a stand or display, whatever have you. That works perfectly well too. So those are just some really rough basics. Other things you're going to find is working with the tools I gave everybody. And these are just some tools. And are you going to use every one of these? No. Are you probably more likely you're going to find a couple that you really like? And those are going to be the ones you use like all the time, because you just find different ways of working with like this paddle tool. One side's a bit flatter like a chisel. The other side is a bit more rounded like a butter knife. But then you also have like the edges and such. So it's not just like smearing and scraping tools. It then also becomes something like notching in and making lines, anything like that. Or for that matter, I was working on this kind of weird looking thingy. You could use it for just making really light streaks across the surface. Or for that matter, how you could start to smooth one side down that starts to create like a crevice there. And you can blend that over. And you ultimately end up creating a partial ridge and such. So there's going to be a bunch of different ways to use these tools. And it's really just going to become, what's that?
Textures too.
Exactly.
I use like the flat one for my balloons.
Exactly. So the other thing is going to be, yeah, you're shaping, you're designing your piece, but it's going to also be based around texture, your surface. Because one of the points of this project is, yes, you're merging forms, but you also want to figure out how you can apply the applicable surface. Like you're saying there, some things are going to have smoother surfaces, some things are going to be actually highly textured. So these can also work as ways of like just randomly dimpling a tool or an object, and you'll start to get odd surfaces depending on how you apply pressure. These things have knurls on them. This knobbly textured bit here, you could roll that along the surface and create a pretty even, almost mechanical looking surface, much more like a grid work, that sort. So that can work. I highly recommend experimenting. Like was just said earlier, aluminum foil, different things you're pressing into the clay. Aluminum foil works for a really nice way to create like a very like rock-like surface, or just heavily detailed, but very non-uniform textured surface. So you can really start to create some odd surfaces that way. Same thing goes with just finding other things. A wire tool, like a wire brush or a toothbrush or anything like that, obviously not one you're going to want to use ever again because that crap doesn't exactly come off of there. But you could use this to stipple the surface, which stippling is just applying direct pressure repeatedly. And depending on how hard you hit, of course, if you're holding this and it's wire, be very careful that you don't just stab yourself and thoroughly perforate your own fingers. But you can really get some really neat surfaces. I don't know how well that comes through. There we go. You can really get some really neat surfaces out of like just wire tools as well.
I use scissors too.
Scissors, I've been told, work really
Like
well.
cut at it.
What's that?
I like cut at it, like not like enough to cut through, but just like the tips of it.
Yeah, I actually had somebody else this semester do it.
For my dog last time.
Right. Yeah, just unexpected, like just, and this is obviously a pair of clippers here, but chopping into the surface, chopping into the edges. You're trying to make just odd forms or uneven surfaces or things like that. Experiment. The best thing I can tell you is experiment with this. I've got a ruler here. This works really nicely. Slapping in, and you can create a very uneven but fairly parallel set of striations that start to become like very bark-like. So really simple surface there, and it starts to get really heavily textured. This brush also works extremely well for creating more of like fur-like surfaces. Now this will start to pull some little boogers on there, so be careful with that, but maybe that's something you'd like. But depending on how heavily you pull the wire tool through, you can create some pretty heavily textured surface, or for that matter, start to swirl it, and you'll start to create more of fur patterns. So that's one way. Of course, again, like I just said, you get into some pretty heavy boogers and all of that. So deal with that. They'll come off pretty readily. But the best thing I can say is experiment. Keep a brick of clay or keep a few chunks of clay handy and just play with it. Literally slap at it with stuff, drag things through it, combine them, cut into it. Scissors, be careful if you start getting pretty snippy with that. You don't want to actually cut into your finger again. Again, you don't exactly want clay goop into there. One other thing I want to briefly go over. All right, you've got a bunch of stuff, you got some heavy texture going, but there's some areas that you want to be fairly smooth. So one of the ways of doing that, first, just keep blending and such with your thumb and such. At some point, it's going to take on too much heat and it's going to start just getting really tacky. You could either dunk that in water and let it cool it off a little bit. This is oil-based. It's going to repel water. Stick it in the fridge or the freezer for a few minutes. Or, all right, take a break. Go get up, take a walk for a little while, whatever. But one of the things is water will help break down, or at least it will help keep your fingers from getting too sticky from all the oil on the clay. Get your fingers a little bit wet. It's not going to absorb into the clay, but what it'll do is it will cool the clay surface, and it will also allow your finger to roll over the surface a little more smoothly. And this is a way where you can really get a pretty solid burnish out of the surface. So if you're trying to get this actually to be pretty smooth, like actually reflective smooth, this is a way you could do that. Now, of course, ideally I'd blow on this, but we're wearing masks in the room, so not as effective. So I don't know, flick it around and try not to throw it across the room while you're doing that. But I don't know how well you can see this, but this really starts to take on a very smooth surface. Now say, all right, I like that, but I kind of got a much larger surface to work with, or it's a more undulating surface, something like that. Maybe it's not something I can more easily run my finger across, but I still want it to be smoother. That's when chemicals can come in. Am I talking deep, heavy chemicals? God, no. This is just rubbing alcohol, just isopropyl rubbing alcohol. What this will do is it's just enough of a degreasing agent to break down the oil on the surface of the clay. So what this is going to do is just that. You've got all this sticky texture on there. Or I'll tell you what, let's do it more on a spot that's got some actual texture on it. Spray a little bit, and I can either just wipe it down. If you have a clean rag, these paper towels are awful. I would not recommend using these, but it will allow you to smooth this out a little bit. And it'll also take some of the sheen off. The problem with something like this is it will also, if you have too much texture, it will also start to kind of remove that because it is actually breaking down the surface and breaking down that oil a little bit. So there is that. But that's just, like I said, just rubbing alcohol. Rubbing alcohol or water makes for a really smooth surface. Now that the water's going to dry it up off of this first piece, yeah, that really makes for a very smooth surface there. So those are just some of the basics I wanted to go over with everybody. Make your own wire tools, or rather a wire cutter tool. That's really handy. Wire for an armature, aluminum foil for a core armature. You can combine these if you want this to be pretty pliable, but also rigid. So maybe you have a form that sticks way off the surface, but it's really quite thin. You could have a wire armature wrapped in foil and then put your clay around that. You can add pieces on top of and just stick into the clay and foil and such. You can combine parts very readily, and the benefit of doing stuff with like this is you don't have to blend it as thoroughly. So if you wanted this to be a very distinctly different section, like maybe you're making something like bird-like or something, you got like the body, but then you want these really slender little legs, that's exactly how you could do that. Just by applying your clay onto the onto an armature and then just jamming it into the body. Again, make sure you don't miss the body and into your finger. But those are the real basics of this stuff. It's like a lot of tools, very simple work, a lot to learn it when it comes to technique. So best thing I can tell you is just experiment with this stuff. Play around with it, see where it takes you. Now, few people, Sam included there, I've put a piece of paper down. This stuff will stain. These little clay blobs will go everywhere. I recommend like either a piece of paper or a tray or something like that. You could even use like an old cookie sheet. They make silicone trays, like, would you say Target or like dollar store, places like those. You can find something online easily too if you want. This project is meant to be very mobile. So experiment, play, see where that takes you. You go from there. The one last thing is, like I said, this is oil-based. The red in this is actually from iron oxide, rust. It's not like these are rusty and you're going to get tetanus from playing with this. It's a much more like chemically pure iron oxide. But the red will get onto stuff, including your clothes. And then, of course, the oil is harder to get off. Use warm water and like dish soap, some sort of degreasing dish soap. Here we have like the automotive cleaner that has pumice stone in it. That works really well, further drying out everybody's hands. But use some kind of degreaser. Doesn't have to be like heavy chemical, like literally dish soap works really well with that. And just some hot water or some warm water, that'll break it down. And yeah, that helps with cleanup really well. So experiment, play, see where it takes you. Keep some extra chunks handy while you're working just to test out some pieces. But you'll find some really surprising ways of working. Some people have been using straws pressed in, or for that matter, even pen caps, like just a little hole in the pen cap, repeatedly pecking the surface, and you end up with like this kind of like dinosaur scale texture or something like that. So you can really get some surprising results with just crap laying around. So try it out. That's what I wanted to talk to everybody about. So thank you very much.